You know, deep at the base of your brain, there's this tiny but incredibly powerful structure. People often call it the master gland. And today, that's exactly what we're going to explore, the hypothalamic pituitary axis. We're going to really focus on the pituitary gland itself, its structure, its functions, and that absolutely vital connection it has to the hypothalamus. So let's dive into this master control system, starting right at the beginning with the architecture of the pituitary gland. So here's our game plan. We'll kick things off with the pituitary gland's basic structure. Then we'll get into the really interesting part, the surprisingly different origins of its two lobes. After that, we'll see how the anterior lobe works as a kind of hormone factory and even peek at its cellular machinery. And finally, we'll uncover how the posterior lobe is directly wired into the hypothalamus. All right, let's start with the fundamentals, the physical structure of the pituitary gland. To really get what it does, we first need to understand what it looks like. And you'll often hear it called by its scientific name, the hypophysis. So, what is it? Well, the pituitary is an endocrine gland. That just means its main job is to secrete hormones right into the bloodstream to act as chemical messengers. It's split into two main parts, an anterior and a posterior lobe, and together, wow, they run a huge range of your body's most vital functions, everything from growth to your metabolism. It is just remarkable how much control is packed into such a tiny package. The adult pituitary gland, it only weighs about 1 gram, and it's roughly a centimeter across. I mean, think about that. It's a stunning example of biological efficiency, where something that weighs less than a paperclip is calling the shots for the entire body. So where exactly is this thing hiding? Well, the gland is tucked away securely in a protective little bony cavity at the base of the skull. It's called the sella turcica, which is Latin for Turkish saddle, and what's really crucial here is that it's connected to a part of the brain called the hypothalamus by the pituitary stalk. This physical connection is the absolute foundation of the entire system. Okay, now let's look at its physiological divisions. The scientific names themselves actually give us a pretty big clue about what they do. The anterior pituitary is called the adenohypophysis. That adeno part refers to its glandular, hormone-making nature. The posterior pituitary is the neurohypophysis. Neuro, as you probably guessed, hints that it comes from neural or nerve tissue. And sandwiched between them is a small region called the pars intermedia, which is less developed in humans but still part of the whole picture. This brings us to a really fundamental question. Why are these two lobes so different? And the answer, it turns out, is in their embryological origins. As we're about to see, this is a perfect example of a core principle in biology. Structure dictates function. So get this, the two lobes develop from completely separate paths. The anterior pituitary starts out as something called Rothke's pouch, which is basically an upward budding of epithelial tissue from the pharynx, the area at the back of your throat. But the posterior pituitary, it's a totally different story. It develops as a downward extension of the hypothalamus itself. This means it's made of neural tissue. It's literally an extension of the brain. So that glandular origin explains why the anterior lobe's main job is to be a hormone factory. Let's take a look inside this biological factory at the 6 key peptide hormones it produces. And remember, peptides are just small proteins that act as these incredibly powerful signaling molecules all over the body. Okay, so the anterior pituitary is responsible for 6 major hormones, and each one has a critical mission. First up, growth hormone, or GH, which, well, it does exactly what its name says. It stimulates overall body growth. Second is ACTH, which controls hormone secretion from the adrenal cortex, and that has a huge impact on our metabolism and stress response. Third, TSH. Think of this one as your body's thermostat, because it regulates your thyroid hormones. Fourth, prolactin, which stimulates breast development and milk production. And finally, we have the 2 gonadotropins, FSH and LH, which are absolutely essential for regulating the function of the ovaries and testes. All right, we've seen what hormones are made. Now let's zoom in on these specialized cells that actually do the work. We're going to explore the cellular machinery of the anterior lobe by looking at the 5 distinct cell types responsible for all this amazing hormone production. The cellular makeup here is really specific. A huge chunk, about 30 to 40%, are somatrophs. Those are the cells that produce growth hormone. Another 20% are corticotrophs, which make ACTH. The rest of the cell types, while there aren't as many of them, are responsible for producing those other powerful hormones that regulate our thyroid, reproductive functions, and lactation. This really shows the specific division of labor inside the anterior pituitary. Each cell type has a clear, dedicated job. Somatotrophs are the growth hormone specialists. Corticotrophs handle ACTH. Thyrotrophs are for TSH. Gonadotrophs are the multitaskers, producing both FSH and LH. And finally, the lactotrophs are in charge of prolactin. It's just an incredibly organized and efficient system for endocrine control. Now here's a fascinating little detail that connects this biology to actual clinical medicine. Under a microscope, those somatotrophs, the growth hormone producers, they stain really strongly with acidic dyes. This classifies them as acidophils, or acid-loving cells. So, and this is the important part, when a pituitary tumor develops from these specific cells, it's referred to in a clinical setting as an acidophilic tumor. Okay, time to shift our focus to the other half of this story, the posterior lobe. And as we're about to find out, its relationship with the hypothalamus is way more direct because it isn't really a separate gland at all. It is, quite literally, an extension of the brain. The posterior pituitary is all about 2 crucial hormones. The first is antidiuretic hormone, or ADH. This one is vital for keeping our body's water balanced by precisely controlling how much water our kidneys excrete. The second is oxytocin, which you might have heard of as the bonding hormone. It's also famous for its critical roles in stimulating uterine contractions during childbirth and milk ejection during breastfeeding. So here is the single most important point about the posterior lobe. Unlike the anterior lobe, it doesn't manufacture its own hormones. It doesn't have any of those hormone-producing glandular cells. Instead, it just acts as a storage and release site for hormones that are produced somewhere else entirely. So, if the posterior pituitary doesn't make them, where do they come from? Well, the answer takes us right back up to the hypothalamus. These hormones are actually synthesized in the cell bodies of large, specialized neurons called magnocellular neurons. And these neuron cell bodies are all clustered together in 2 specific spots in the hypothalamus, the supraoptic and the paraventricular nuclei. This whole pathway is just a perfect example of something called neurosecretion. First, ADH and oxytocin are made in those magnocellular neurons, deep inside the hypothalamus. Second, these hormones are packaged up and transported down these long nerve fibers, what's called the neuron's axoplasm, all the way through the pituitary stalk. Finally, they arrive at the nerve endings in the posterior pituitary, where they're stored, just waiting, ready to be released into the bloodstream the moment a signal arrives from the brain. Wow, we've covered a lot of ground, from the embryological origins of the pituitary all the way to its intricate cellular machinery and neural connections. So now, let's tie all these concepts together with a quick scientific summary, just to lock in the most critical takeaways. So, what's the one thing you should absolutely remember from all this? It's that the pituitary gland is this brilliant fusion of 2 totally different systems. On one side, you have the anterior pituitary, the Adenohypophysis. It's born from epithelial tissue, and it acts like a true hormone factory, carefully producing and secreting signals that regulate long-term things like growth and metabolism. But on the other side, you have the posterior pituitary, the Neurohypophysis, which is a direct extension of the brain. It doesn't make anything. It's a rapid-release depot for hormones made up in the hypothalamus, designed for incredibly swift action. And that leaves us with a final thought to mull over.
We've seen that the posterior pituitary is basically a bundle of nerve endings, while the anterior pituitary has to rely on this more complex, multi-step system. So how does that direct neural wiring allow the posterior pituitary to respond to the body's needs so much faster? It's a fascinating question that really highlights the elegant efficiency of our body's master control system. Thanks for joining me in this exploration.
Welcome! Today, we're going to dive deep into the absolutely critical relationship between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. This connection is really a cornerstone of endocrinology. And in this explainer, we're going to break down the precise biological mechanisms that make it all work. Okay, let's get right into it. So, here's our game plan. First, we'll talk about the real controller of the master gland. Then we'll get into the two very different ways the hypothalamus manages everything. After that, we'll explore the special bridge that connects them, look at the messenger hormones themselves, and then meet the pituitary cells that get those messages, before we wrap it all up with a good summary. You've probably heard the pituitary gland called the master gland, right? Well, that's kind of old news. The real leap in understanding our endocrine system came when we figured out that the pituitary itself is actually taking orders from a higher command, and that's the hypothalamus. It's the true command center, the real regulatory hub of the whole operation. So how does this command center even know what orders to send out? Well, think of the hypothalamus as this incredible information processing center. It's constantly getting signals from all over your body. Things like pain, your emotional state, and maybe most importantly, the exact chemistry of your blood. It's keeping tabs on hormone levels, body temperature, you name it, all to maintain that perfect internal balance we call homeostasis. Now, what's really fascinating here is that the hypothalamus doesn't just use one method to control the pituitary. It actually has two completely different strategies, one for each of the pituitary's two lobes. So let's break down how this elegant dual system really works. And this really lays it out perfectly. Over on the left, you've got the posterior pituitary, sometimes called the neurohypophysis. Its control is all about direct neural signals. It's basically hardwired right into the hypothalamus. But then, on the right, you have the anterior pituitary, or adenohypophysis, and it's controlled in a totally different way, using hormonal signals that have to travel through blood vessels. The control for the posterior pituitary is just beautiful in its simplicity. Here's the key thing to remember. The posterior lobe doesn't actually make its own hormones. Nope. They're made up in the hypothalamus, then they travel down these long nerve fibers and are just released directly into the bloodstream from nerve endings that are located in the posterior pituitary. It's really just a specialized storage and release warehouse. So that covers the posterior lobe. But how did scientists figure out that the anterior lobe was a different beast entirely? Well, a classic experiment really cracked the case. Researchers took the pituitary gland and transplanted it to another part of the body, completely severing its direct connection to the hypothalamus. And what happened? The secretion of most of those anterior hormones, like TSH, ACTH, and growth hormone, just plummeted. But, and this is the big twist, one hormone, prolactin, actually went up. This one experiment proved two massive things. The anterior pituitary absolutely depends on continuous signals from the hypothalamus, and the main signal for prolactin has to be stop, not go. Okay, so if there aren't any nerves going to the anterior pituitary, how in the world do those crucial hormonal signals get there? The answer is just this beautiful piece of biological plumbing, a specialized circulatory system that's like a private, high-speed bridge between the two. And this bridge has a name, the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system. Now, a portal system is basically a circulatory shortcut. Its job here is absolutely critical. It takes those hypothalamic hormones and delivers them straight to their target cells in the anterior pituitary. This means they get there fast and in a really high concentration, because they don't get diluted by mixing with all the blood in the rest of your body. Let's actually trace that path. First, blood goes into a primary set of tiny capillaries in a part of the hypothalamus called the median eminence. that's where the hypothalamus dumps its messenger hormones. From there, that hormone-rich blood flows down these special portal veins and then into a second set of capillaries that are spread all through the anterior pituitary, delivering those command signals right where they need to go. All right, so we've seen the delivery route. Now let's talk about the messages themselves, the specific hormones that are either releasing or inhibiting something. These are made by special neurons in the hypothalamus, and really, their only job is to control what the anterior pituitary does. This table gives us a fantastic look at the key players. Let's just walk through it. First up are the releasing hormones. We have TRH, which tells the pituitary to release TSH for your thyroid. There's CRH, which stimulates the release of ACTH for your stress response. Then there's GnRH, which triggers the release of both LH and FSH for reproduction. Now look at growth hormone. It's special. It has both a releasing hormone, GHRH, and an inhibiting hormone, GHIH. This allows for super precise control. And last but not least, we have prolactin inhibiting hormone, or PIH, which we now know is actually the neurotransmitter dopamine. And this brings us right back around to that transplantation experiment. See, the hypothalamus normally has its foot on the brake, sending a constant or tonic inhibitory signal to stop prolactin secretion. That brake is dopamine. So when the transplant cut that connection, it was like lifting the foot off the brake pedal. The inhibition was gone, and prolactin secretion just shot up. Okay, so we've talked about the commands and the delivery system. Now let's actually go inside the anterior pituitary and meet the specialized cells that receive these commands and then secrete their own powerful hormones out into the rest of the body. So if you were to look at anterior pituitary tissue under a microscope with some special stains, you'd see two main types of cells. On one side, you have the chromophobes, which literally means color-fearing. They don't pick up the stain very well because they don't have many hormone granules inside, so they're not very active. And then you have the chromophils, the color-loving cells. They stain really brightly because they are just packed with secretory granules. These are the workhorses, the ones actively making and releasing hormones. We can even divide those busy chromophil cells into two more groups. You've got the acidophils, which stain with acidic dyes, and they're the ones making growth hormone and prolactin. Then you have the basophils, which stain with basic dyes, and they produce the other four big ones, LH, FSH, TSH, and ACTH. This kind of specialization is what makes sure that the right command from the hypothalamus triggers the release of exactly the right hormone. Now for one last, really cool layer of biological efficiency. See, not all hormones are just built in their final form. Sometimes a cell will make a really big precursor molecule, a prohormone, which can then be chopped up later to create several different active hormones. And the most famous example of this in the pituitary is a giant molecule called pro-opiomelanocortin, or POMC for short. You can think of this POMC molecule as a kind of biological multi-tool. It's one big protein that enzymes can come in and snip apart to produce a few totally different active hormones. So from this one precursor, the pituitary gets ACTH, which we know is essential for our stress response, but it also gets other things, like beta-lipotropin, which is involved in fat metabolism, and beta-endorphin, which is one of the body's own natural painkillers. It's just an incredibly efficient way to do things, make one big molecule that can serve a bunch of different functions. Okay, let's pull all these different pieces together now and do a quick recap of this elegant, coordinated system we call the hypothalamic pituitary axis. So what are the big takeaways here? Well, first, the hypothalamus is the true master regulator, pulling in information from all over the body. It uses a dual control strategy, simple, direct wiring for the posterior pituitary, and a more complex hormonal system for the anterior pituitary, which relies on that special portal blood system. Then these very specific hypothalamic hormones act on very specific pituitary cells, creating this precise chain of command that is just fundamental to keeping our bodies in balance. And that leaves us with one final thought to chew on. Since we know the hypothalamus is always listening to signals from our body and our environment, you have to wonder, how might things from our modern lifestyle, like chronic stress or maybe a poor diet, disrupt the incredibly delicate signaling that happens in this axis? And what could the long-term consequences of that disruption be for our overall health? Today, we're diving deep into the adenohypophysis. which you probably know as the anterior pituitary gland. Now, it might be small, but this gland is an absolute biological powerhouse. You can think of it as a command center that's directing many of your body's most essential functions, everything from your daily metabolism all the way to long-term reproduction.
So let's jump right in. We'll start with a quick overview of this command center, and then we're going to explore the 4 major hormonal systems it controls. First, prolactin, the nurturing hormone. Then TSH, which is our metabolic accelerator. After that, ACTH, the chief of our stress response. And finally, we'll look at LH and FSH, the 2 hormones that govern the reproductive axis.
Okay, first, let's lay the groundwork. The adenohypophysis is quite simply the front lobe of the pituitary gland, and its main job is to create and release a whole host of essential hormones. But, and this is key, it doesn't operate alone. Think of it more like a highly responsive deputy. Its activity is precisely controlled by signals. These are releasing and inhibiting hormones that are sent down from its superior, the hypothalamus. So, our first hormone is prolactin. This one plays an incredibly well-known and pivotal role in motherhood and our nurturing instincts. Prolactin, or PRL for short, comes from a specific type of cell in the anterior pituitary called acidophils. They just get that name because they stain really well with acidic dyes in the lab. And while prolactin has a few different functions, its most critical and well-understood role is tied directly to lactation. That is, the development of mammary glands and, of course, the eventual secretion of milk. Now, what's really fascinating here is that prolactin doesn't work in isolation. It's a total team player. Throughout a pregnancy, it's collaborating with other hormones like estrogen and cortisol to get the mammary glands ready. Then, after delivery, it partners up with insulin and cortisol to flip the switch on the actual synthesis and secretion of milk. To really grasp its impact, just consider the sheer scale of this change. In someone who isn't pregnant, prolactin levels are typically quite low, maybe around 10 nanograms per milliliter. But during pregnancy, these levels can surge up to 20 times that amount. It's a massive increase, and it's absolutely necessary to prepare the body for lactation. This process is a beautiful demonstration of the direct link between our nervous system and our endocrine system. It's a classic feedback loop. So, a physical stimulus, like suckling, activates these things called mechanoreceptors. This sends a direct nerve signal right up to the hypothalamus, which then instructs the anterior pituitary, hey, release more prolactin. This ensures the milk supply continues to meet demand. The body is so smart, it even uses a sophisticated 2-stage system. In the final days before birth, the glands produce a very small amount of a fat-free, super nutrient-rich fluid called colostrum. Then, after birth, driven by those high prolactin levels we talked about, the system shifts gears into high-volume milk production, capable of generating up to 1.5 liters every single day. Prolactin also has another really profound effect on the reproductive cycle. You see, high levels of prolactin, stimulated by breastfeeding, cause the hypothalamus to release more dopamine. This dopamine then suppresses another key hormone, GnRH, and that reduction in GnRH leads to less of the reproductive hormones, FSH and LH, which effectively pauses the menstrual cycle. This natural temporary state is known as lactational amenorrhea. All right, next up is thyroid-stimulating hormone, or TSH. You can think of this hormone as the body's primary metabolic thermostat. TSH is produced by a different cell type in the anterior pituitary called basophils. And again, that name just comes from the fact that they take up basic dyes in the lab. Now, unlike some other pituitary hormones that have multiple targets, TSH has a very singular mission. Its job is to manage and control all the activity of the thyroid gland. As you can see, TSH is involved in every single step of producing the thyroid hormones that regulate our metabolism. It kickstarts the uptake of iodine, it triggers the creation and later the breakdown of a precursor molecule called thyroglobulin, and finally, it enhances the synthesis and release of the active hormones, T3 and T4. And its effects aren't just biochemical. overstimulation by TSH doesn't just increase hormone output, it physically changes the thyroid gland's structure. Long-term excess can cause the gland's cells to get bigger and even multiply, a condition called hyperplasia, which leads to an overall enlargement of the gland itself. Okay, now we turn to the chief of the stress response, adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH. This hormone is absolutely central to how our body manages stress of any kind. So ACTH is a polypeptide hormone, which just means it's made of a chain of amino acids. It has a pretty complex origin story, starting its life as part of a much larger precursor molecule called pro-opiomelanocortin, or POMC. Once it's processed and released from those basophilic cells, its main target is the adrenal cortex. That's the outer layer of the adrenal glands that sit right on top of our kidneys. I want you to think about ACTH's impact as happening in two distinct phases. The early, immediate effects are all biochemical. They trigger signaling pathways that rapidly increase the secretion of the stress hormone cortisol. But the late or long-term effects are structural. They promote the growth of the adrenal gland, increase protein synthesis, and even boost blood flow to make sure the gland is ready for whatever future demands come its way. This is such a classic example of a negative feedback loop, a beautiful self-regulating biological system. So, stress causes the hypothalamus to release CRH. That tells the pituitary to release ACTH, which in turn tells the adrenal cortex to release cortisol. But here's the critical part. Cortisol then travels back and puts the brakes on both the hypothalamus and the pituitary. This ensures our stress response is powerful, but also very tightly controlled. And this entire system also follows a natural daily rhythm, or a circadian rhythm. Levels of both ACTH and cortisol naturally peak in the early morning. This helps wake us up and prepare our bodies for the stresses of the day. Then the levels gradually fall, reaching their lowest point at night, which allows our body to rest and recover. Finally, let's explore the two hormones that govern the reproductive axis: luteinizing hormone, or LH, and follicle-stimulating hormone, or FSH. Now, these two hormones are often known collectively as the gonadotropins. They get that name simply because they target the gonads, the testes in males and the ovaries in females. They're secreted by a specialized type of basophil called a gonadotroph, and just like the other hormones we've talked about, they're under the direct command of a releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, which in this case is GnRH.
In males, you can think of these two hormones as having very distinct but perfectly complementary jobs. Luteinizing hormone, LH, stimulates the Leydig cells in the testes, and that's what triggers the production of testosterone. Follicle-stimulating hormone, FSH, on the other hand, acts directly on the process of spermatogenesis, driving the development of sperm cells.
And here's why that partnership is so crucial. Neither hormone can get the job done alone. FSH needs testosterone to be present to fully drive sperm production. And since testosterone production requires LH, well, you see where this is going. Both hormones absolutely must work in tandem to ensure male fertility. It is a required partnership. So this table gives us a really nice, concise summary of the entire hormonal toolkit we've just explored. You can see each hormone, its cellular source, right there in the pituitary, its primary target organ, and its vital mission. Everything from lactation and metabolism to the stress response and reproduction. From managing our daily stress to regulating our metabolism and even creating new life, the anterior pituitary conducts this incredibly complex and delicate hormonal symphony. It's a truly remarkable example of precision control. And it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other intricate systems are quietly working right now to keep our bodies in perfect balance?
Hello and welcome. Today, we're diving deep into the brain's role as the body's ultimate command center. We're going to look at the really intricate hormonal systems that are controlled by two tiny but incredibly powerful structures, the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. Let's get started.
So here's the big question that drives our whole discussion. How is it possible that this one tiny spot in your brain can control something as huge as reproduction, or something as moment to moment as the amount of water in your blood? It's a fundamental question in physiology, and by the end of this, you'll have a really clear picture of how this amazing piece of biological engineering actually works.
All right, here's our roadmap. We'll start with the master gland itself. Then we'll get into the specific hormones of the sexual cycle. After that, we'll look at how the brain has a direct neural line of control. We'll zero in on a fascinating water-saving hormone, and then we'll wrap it all up by comparing the two very different systems working inside the pituitary.
Okay, first up, let's talk about the absolute core of our story, this relationship between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. I want you to think of the hypothalamus as the CEO of a company, and the pituitary as the senior manager right below it, taking those top-level orders and directing all the different operations throughout the body.
The very first command in this chain is a hormone called gonadotropin releasing hormone, or GnRH. This hormone gets made up in the hypothalamus, and it really does act like a master key. Its whole job is to travel down to the pituitary gland and unlock the release of a whole other set of hormones. Now, if you look at some older literature, you might see it called FRF or LRF. Don't let that throw you. They all refer to the exact same essential signaling molecule.
So, once GnRH delivers its signal, the anterior pituitary, that's the front part of the gland, gets the message and springs into action. This part of the system is mainly in charge of regulating those long-term cyclical processes. And, the best example of this is, of course, the reproductive cycle.
Now, one of the most elegant things about this whole system is how it keeps itself in balance. It uses something called a negative feedback loop. Let's look at the male system as a clear example. The hypothalamus releases GnRH. That tells the pituitary to release LH and FSH. Those hormones then tell the testes to produce testosterone. But here's the crucial part. As testosterone levels get higher, the testosterone itself sends a signal back to the brain, basically saying, okay, we have enough, and it shuts down the release of GnRH and LH. It's a beautiful, self-regulating system.
In the female reproductive cycle, those same two hormones, FSH and LH, have very distinct but perfectly coordinated jobs. You've got follicle-stimulating hormone, or FSH, which does exactly what it says. It promotes the growth of follicles in the ovary. Then there's luteinizing hormone, or LH, which is the absolute critical trigger for ovulation, the moment the egg is released. After ovulation, LH also helps create the corpus luteum, which is super important if a pregnancy occurs. The whole cycle is just this precise, organized dance of these hormone levels rising and falling.
What's interesting is that this complex system isn't running from day one. Throughout childhood, it's pretty much dormant. But then, right around age 8, the pituitary starts to wake up and begins to gradually secrete more and more of these gonadotropins, LH and FSH. This slow ramp-up of hormones eventually leads to the start of the monthly cycle, which for most people is somewhere between the ages of 11 and 15. This hormonal dance becomes incredibly dramatic right before ovulation. If you look at a chart of the cycle, you see this massive, sharp spike in LH levels, along with a smaller peak in FSH. This LH surge is the direct, non-negotiable trigger for ovulation. So the really important scientific question becomes, what causes that sudden spike?
And the answer is just fascinating. It all comes down to the dual role of estrogen. See, for most of the cycle, estrogen acts as a brake, using negative feedback to keep LH and FSH levels in check. But then, as estrogen levels climb and hit a really high peak right before ovulation, the system completely flips. At that high concentration, estrogen suddenly switches to a positive feedback loop, telling the pituitary to release that enormous surge of LH. It's an amazing example of how one hormone can have two totally opposite effects, and it all depends on its concentration and the timing.
Okay, let's switch gears and pivot to the other half of the gland, the posterior pituitary, also called the neurohypophysis. Now, if the anterior pituitary was like a manager getting hormonal memos, think of the posterior pituitary as a direct, hardwired phone line straight from the brain.
And this is a really key difference. The neurohypophysis isn't a factory making its own hormones. It's more like a warehouse or a shipping depot. It just stores and releases hormones that are actually produced way up in the hypothalamus.
Its physical structure tells the whole story. It's not made of glandular cells that produce anything. Instead, it's made of supportive cells and, most importantly, the endings, the terminals, of long nerve cells that start up in the hypothalamus. These nerve endings are just packed with little bubbles of hormones. There's even a classic experiment that proves this. If you cut the stalk connecting the pituitary to the brain, hormones can still be released from those severed nerve endings. It's definitive proof that the factory is in the hypothalamus, not the pituitary itself.
So the whole process is a really clear three-step journey. First, hormones like ADH and oxytocin are built in the hypothalamus. Second, they're packaged up and shipped down these long nerve axons, a trip that can actually take a few days. And finally, they're stored down in the posterior pituitary, basically just waiting for a direct nerve signal from the brain to say go and release them into the bloodstream.
So let's zoom in on one of those hormones, ADH, which stands for antidiuretic hormone. The name tells you what it does. Antidiuresis literally means to prevent water loss. This one hormone is the master regulator of your body's hydration level.
And the potency of ADH is just staggering. All it takes is about 2 nanograms, that's 2 billionths of a gram, to cause a major change in how much water your kidneys let go of. This just highlights how incredibly sensitive and efficient this whole regulatory system is. It's mind-boggling.
So how does it actually work? Well, it's all about making part of your kidney waterproof or not. When there's no ADH around, the collecting ducts in the kidneys are essentially waterproof. Water stays trapped in the urine, so you produce a lot of very dilute urine. But when ADH shows up, it makes those same ducts permeable to water. Suddenly, water can escape and get reabsorbed back into your blood. The result? A small amount of very concentrated urine. It's like ADH is controlling a tiny dam.
At the molecular level, the secret to changing this permeability is these little things called aquaporins, or water channels. They are basically protein pores that water can flow through. These pores are kept stored inside little bubbles, or vesicles, inside the kidney cells. ADH is the signal that tells the cell to move those bubbles to the surface, fuse with the membrane, and plug in the water channels. Here's the play-by-play of how that happens inside the cell. First, ADH binds to its receptor on the outside of the kidney cell. This kicks off a chain reaction inside, leading to an increase in a famous little molecule called cyclic AMP, or CAMP. This CAMP then activates another enzyme, protein kinase A, and that is what gives the final command for the vesicles filled with aquaporins to move to the membrane and fuse with it. In an instant, the cell goes from being a wall to being a sieve for water.
Okay, let's pull all of this together now. What we've seen are two completely different operating systems working out of a single gland. One is based on hormones and is relatively slow, while the other is neural and lightning fast.
This table sums it up perfectly. You've got the anterior pituitary, controlled by hormones, it makes its own hormones, it's connected to the brain by blood vessels, and it handles long-term projects like the sexual cycle. Then you have the posterior pituitary, controlled by direct nerve impulses, it only stores hormones made elsewhere, it's connected by nerve axons, and it's built for rapid, immediate responses like managing water balance. Two distinct methods for two very different types of jobs, all in one place.
And that really leads us to a final, thought-provoking question. We've seen how this incredible intersection of a slow hormonal system and a fast neural system is essential for things like reproduction and water balance. So it makes you wonder, what other critical processes in our bodies, maybe something like our stress response or how we regulate our metabolism, also depend on this unique meeting point where the brain's direct wiring meets the body's chemical mail system? Thank you for joining me for this explainer.
Hello and welcome. Today we're diving deep into the posterior pituitary gland to look at two absolutely critical hormones, antidiuretic hormone or ADH and oxytocin. Now these aren't just any molecules. You can think of them as master regulators that control some of the most fundamental processes in our bodies. Everything from keeping our water balance just right to the powerful events of childbirth. So let's get started. Here's a quick look at our roadmap for this explainer. We'll kick things off with ADH, really digging into how it works at a cellular level and the feedback loops that keep it in check. Then, we'll explore what happens clinically when that system breaks down,
After that, we'll switch gears to oxytocin to understand its huge role in labor and lactation, and we'll wrap it all up with a nice scientific summary.
All right, first on our list is antidiuretic hormone, ADH. You might also hear it called vasopressin. Its main job? To be the body's chief water conservation officer. And it performs this role with incredible precision, right down at the cellular level inside our kidneys.
So let's walk through how this actually works. It all starts when ADH finds and binds to its specific receptor, the V2 receptor on the surface of a kidney cell. This connection kicks off a chain reaction inside the cell. First, an enzyme called adenylate cyclase gets switched on and it starts producing a very important messenger molecule called cyclic AMP, or CAMP. As CAMP levels rise, it activates another enzyme, protein kinase A. Now, this kinase's job is to add a little phosphate tag to specific bubbles or vesicles that are floating around inside the cell. And what's inside these vesicles is really the key to this whole thing. You see, those vesicles are packed with a protein called aquaporin 2. The best way to think of it is as a prepackaged Watergate. Once those vesicles get tagged by the kinase, they travel to the cell's surface, the side that's facing the urine, and they merge with it. This inserts those aquaporin channels directly into the membrane. And just like that, a membrane that was basically waterproof is now suddenly full of tiny pores that let only water pass through. What's amazing is how fast and efficient this whole process is. From the second ADH shows up, it takes just 5 to 10 minutes to make that membrane permeable to water. And just as importantly, when ADH levels go down, the whole thing reverses just as quickly. The aquaporin channels get pulled back into the cell, effectively shutting the gates. This gives the body incredibly rapid, almost real-time control over its water balance.
And this slide really sums it up perfectly. On the left, without ADH, the cell membrane is like a solid brick wall to water. The water has nowhere to go but to stay in the kidney tubule and get flushed out. The result? A large amount of very dilute urine. But on the right, when ADH is present, those aquaporin 2 channels basically open the floodgates. Water rushes out of the tubule into the kidney cells and gets pulled right back into your bloodstream. This means you produce less urine and it's much more concentrated.
So this begs a really important question. If ADH is so powerful, how does the body know when to release it? Well, the answer lies in some incredibly sophisticated monitoring systems that are always on the job.
I mean, think about it. How does your brain know you're getting dehydrated? Maybe even before you start feeling thirsty? It all comes down to a set of very specialized sensors. These sensors are called osmoreceptors. They're highly specialized neurons located right near the hypothalamus in the brain. Their entire purpose is to constantly sample your blood, detecting even the tiniest shifts in its concentration, or what we call its osmolarity. And the way they work is beautifully simple. When you're dehydrated, your blood becomes more concentrated. It's hypertonic. So through osmosis, water naturally leaves the osmoreceptor cells and moves into the blood. This causes the cells to actually shrink. That physical shrinking is the signal that tells the hypothalamus to release more ADH. On the flip side, if you're overhydrated, your blood gets diluted or hypotonic. Water then moves into the osmoreceptor cells, causing them to swell up. And that swelling is the signal to cut back on ADH secretion. Simple, elegant, and effective. Now, as you can see here, while the concentration of your blood is the main driver, it's not the only thing the body pays attention to. Your body also keeps a close eye on blood volume and pressure. So a big drop in blood volume, which is detected by stretch receptors in your heart, or a fall in blood pressure picked up by baroreceptors in your major arteries, will also trigger a massive release of ADH. And this is actually where its other name, vasopressin, starts to make perfect sense. In an emergency, like a major hemorrhage where ADH levels go through the roof, it doesn't just work on the kidneys. It also binds to different receptors, V1 receptors, on your blood vessels, causing them to squeeze tight. This vasoconstriction directly raises your blood pressure, making it a critical part of the body's emergency response system. But of course, whenever you have such a critical system, any failure can lead to some pretty serious consequences. And that brings us to the clinical condition known as diabetes insipidus. So diabetes insipidus, or DI,
has absolutely nothing to do with blood sugar, unlike diabetes mellitus. But it does share one key symptom: excessive urination, what's known as polyuria. It's caused either by the body not making enough ADH or by the kidneys just not listening to it. The end result is a massive, uncontrolled loss of water, which leads to an intense, unquenchable thirst called polydipsia. As we can see here, DI actually comes in a few different flavors. You have neurogenic or central DI, which is when the brain itself isn't producing enough ADH. Then there's nephrogenic DI, where the ADH levels are fine, but the kidneys are resistant and just won't respond. Dipsogenic DI is a little different. It's a problem of excessive thirst that leads to so much water intake that it suppresses ADH. And finally, there's gestational DI, a temporary form that can happen during pregnancy because enzymes from the placenta actually break down ADH.
And just to put the severity of this into perspective, a typical healthy adult produces what may be 1 to 2 liters of urine a day. Someone with severe DI can produce anywhere from 3 all the way up to an unbelievable 30 liters per day. It's just astonishing. The body essentially becomes a sieve, completely unable to hold on to water. So when doctors are looking to diagnose this, these are the key things they look for. The urine is incredibly dilute, so it has a very low osmolarity and a low specific gravity. Patients almost always have nocturia. They're waking up constantly throughout the night to urinate. And of course, their total daily urine output is way, way above the normal range. Okay, let's now pivot and turn our attention to the second major hormone from the posterior pituitary, oxytocin. Now, if ADH is all about maintaining the body's internal balance, oxytocin's main jobs are directed outward, focusing on the incredible processes of childbirth and lactation. During labor, oxytocin is the star player in a classic positive feedback loop called the Ferguson reflex. Here's how it works. It starts when the baby's head begins to stretch the cervix. This stretching sends a nerve signal all the way up to the hypothalamus, which then signals the pituitary to release oxytocin. Oxytocin travels through the blood to the uterus, causing even stronger contractions. These contractions push the baby's head down more, which stretches the cervix even further, which, you guessed it, signals for even more oxytocin release. This powerful loop just keeps building on itself until the baby is delivered. Now for oxytocin's other major role, lactation. And this is a really important distinction to make. As it says here, oxytocin is for milk ejection, what's often called the letdown. It is not responsible for milk production. That's the job of a totally different hormone called prolactin. Oxytocin's role is to get the milk that's already been made to flow. This process is known as the milk letdown reflex. When a baby suckles, it triggers nerve receptors in the nipple. Just like in labor, this sends a signal straight to the hypothalamus, which triggers a release of oxytocin. That oxytocin travels to the breast and causes tiny, muscle-like cells called myoepithelial cells to contract. They squeeze the little milk storage sacs, the alveoli, and push the milk into the ducts so it can flow to the baby. So, to wrap everything up, let's do a quick recap. We've looked at 2 different hormones, both made in the hypothalamus and released from the posterior pituitary, but each with its own very distinct and absolutely vital job to do. So in a nutshell, ADH, or vasopressin, is the body's chief water regulator. It uses those aquaporin channels to fine-tune water reabsorption in the kidneys, and in a pinch, it can also ramp up blood pressure. Oxytocin, on the other hand, works through these amazing neurohormonal reflexes to drive the powerful muscle contractions needed for both childbirth and milk ejection. And I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder. We saw that ADH is triggered by both high blood concentration, basically thirst, and by low blood volume, like from blood loss. So what happens when you have conflicting signals? For instance, say you've lost a lot of blood, but then you drink a huge amount of pure water. Now your blood volume is still low, but your blood itself is very dilute. One signal is screaming, release ADH, while the other is screaming, stop. How does the body figure out what to do? It's a fascinating question that really highlights the incredible complexity of our internal regulatory systems.